Hmm.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Soul Meets Heart podcast for your soul. This next guest here has spent years building bridges between the places most people keep completely separate: desire, healing, spirituality, and community. She's a counselor, educator, minister in training, I believe, and co founder of the Kink Collective. Please welcome everybody, Kat Orme.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for joining us. We got a couple traditions here on this podcast. The first one is we do a quick little meditation before we start to kind of help you get grounded for the conversation.
Nice.
So really easy. All we're going to do is we're going to breathe in love, 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 and then exhale gratitude. Thank you, thank you, thank you. There you go.
I love
And
that.
then the second tradition that we have here, Kat, is the previous guest on our podcast show left a positive message for you without knowing who the message was going to be for. So hopefully it lands. And if it doesn't, hopefully it lands with whoever's listening to the show today. But their positive message, or the positive message that's being delivered for you specifically, is try not to feel discouraged when you're doing everything you can and nothing works. Jesus is waiting on you to trust him. While you're in the gym taking all of the shots, he's waiting on you to pass the ball. Basketball reference. You could practice perfectly, taking 1,000 shots that you may miss, but he's waiting on you to pass the ball to make those missed shots. Do what you can, execute the purpose given, but don't rely on just yourself. God is waiting on you to pass the ball to take the shot that you cannot.
Nice.
So hopefully that means something to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And
Yeah,
thank
of
you to
course.
whoever sent the message.
Yes, and you'll be leaving me a message for the next guest as well
Apparently,
at the end.
I gather that that's the format here. So I'll have to think of something equally as inspiring to leave the next guest.
Awesome. That'd be great. So, to get started, I wanted to just talk a little bit about your work. You work at the intersection of kink and spirituality,
Hmm.
two spaces that most people would never probably put next to each other. So, when you walk into a room, which part of you shows up first?
Well, I guess I would have to, if I have to pick that, I would say spirituality. Who I am, and our philosophy is people before kink. Like who we are comes before what we do, right? So when you say something like kink, you're most often referring to activities, things that people do, right? And we're much more about who we are as people first. And so my spiritual base, if you will, or my sense of myself as a spiritual person comes with me everywhere I go. It's part of who I am. And so if one has to arrive before the other, I would say that's the order of business.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I believe you've described yourself as a minister in training.
I was a minister in training. I was in school for a while. I didn't finish that program.
Mm,
And so I'm a minister in spirit.
okay,
I don't have any particular letters after my name or licensure in any way. I wasn't ordained.
gotcha.
But as has been made clear to me, I certainly have a ministry and I have a flock and I have people that I care for and tend. And so, for all intents and purposes, I do that kind of work. The plans that I had at the time didn't go the way I thought that they would.
Sure. I was gonna ask you then, I know you've also do grief and trauma counseling,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so maybe you can talk to me a little bit about how those two paths, the specific grief and trauma, intersect with kink and how they end up on the same road for you.
Well, my mother, they came home, my mother and father, when I was 7 years old and announced that mommy had cancer. She passed when I was 11. In those intervening 4 years, she became a spokesperson for what it was. When she had her first surgery, they told her she was cured. They told my father that she was going to die and that he should go home and get their affairs in order. But they
Mm,
told her that she was all cured because that was the best that medicine had to offer 50 years ago. When cancer turned up, she had a single radical mastectomy. And when cancer turned up in the other breast, she determined that it wasn't unrelated. And then she had therefore been lied to. And that started her on a journey where she ended up engaging with a low professor of philosophy near where we lived, who was working with the then newly released book on death and dying by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, where we all became exposed to what we now know as the 5 stages of grief.
mm,
Um, and she began to go around with this professor and lecture to oncology nurses, to people who were dealing with death and dying, and she did it from the standpoint of she found this woman at a lecture that she went to where Dr. Boyle was addressing oncology nurses, because also in those days they put terminal patients on a single ward, so there were like these terminal wards in hospitals, and so these were the nurses who were dealing with those patients, and they were all having a conversation, and my mother sat in the back of the room, and at the end she went up and she said, "Hello, I am one of those people, and I would like to tell you how I would like to be talked to." And so she really started the whole conversation about what does it mean to be a patient, and what is it, how do you want to talk and be talked to. And she did, like, I have a sister, and like my sister and I would get in bed with my mom and we would talk about things like what it was going to be like when mommy was gone and how would we get by and what would happen. And so grieving is a foundational part of my life. I don't, what I like to say to people is I don't know what it's like to have a childhood where your mother dying isn't the centerpiece of your childhood. Right? Like
Yeah.
that is the centerpiece of my childhood. That is what I know. I also had trauma, like everybody, in today's day and age, right? Like I was bullied and I had trouble with my dad. My dad, once my mom passed away, my dad remarried right away, and that was traumatic for me. And so, my actual trauma work, I've only been at probably for the last 5 or 6 years, when I came across CPTSD as a diagnosis. I had always related to PTSD, but didn't have what I thought to be a qualifying event.
Hmm.
Post-traumatic stress disorder usually involves seeing someone get killed, going to war, being raped, like something really significant has to happen for you to have someone say that you have post-traumatic stress disorder. I always related to the symptoms, but I didn't where did it come from. And so this complex post-traumatic stress disorder is very different. It's many traumas over time, usually at the behest of a particular parent, et cetera, et cetera. There's different criteria for that. And that I had in spades. And that sent me down the rabbit hole of doing recovery work from trauma. There's a book that I love called CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. It's not one of the darling books that are out there about trauma recovery, but it was really pivotal for me in my recovery. So those two things go hand in hand for me, the trauma and the grief. And the truth is everyone deals with loss, and everyone deals with trauma to some greater or lesser degree. And people who are involved with kink are no different. And so it just informs everything that I do. Dealing with, kink usually back ends people into their relationship issues, and people's relationship issues are usually fraught with trauma and loss.
Mhm.
So they all kind of go together.
Wow. I mean, to be impacted with such a heavy weight at a young age already, and then being conscious of all the things you're being, because 11, I'm thinking of myself at 11. I don't think I was conscious of everything going on or aware of everything going on, but being forced to be that present at that moment, I think is probably what is the difference between you and I at 11. And the fact that you are creating the space for people to be able to talk about it and to be able to learn things. Like I just learned a lot right now just from this few seconds that you shared. And I'm a not that I'm grieving, but I was a caregiver for someone who had cancer and they had a mastectomy, and I know I'd seen it. It's not fun. I don't wish it on anyone, but I cannot imagine being able to process all of that at 11. So having those conversations, I think, is wonderful that your mom actually sat down and talked to you about everything, because not everybody has that ability to be so open with, especially when they're facing something like that. So when you started your journey, where did you feel like, where did it start exactly? What were the early days of your what you're doing now? Like where was that shift when you
Well,
like started? Because you said 6 years that you've been doing the grief
my
and trauma.
CPTSD trauma sort of recovery stuff. That's what that came up.
Yeah.
The word journey has a few different meanings for me in terms of the travel of my life, right? My grief journey, as you know, starts now from when I'm 7. I got sober when I was 29, and that started a whole new part of my life. And at that time is when I began to deal with things like my sexual orientation, my interest in kink and BDSM, which I had always had, but never had the courage to do anything about or with, at least not outside of the confines of my own mind. And so, sort of a lot of parts of my journey began about 30 plus years ago when that happened. I started to seek out different things. And so at the time I was living in Northern California and, did things around recovery. And I found a partner at the time who was also interested in the same things that I was interested in, BDSM and kink, and exploring those things together. That I did that for about 15 years in California. And then through a long series of events, I ended up back in New York, which is where I started, and about 15 years ago, and met someone who was hosting events. And I was really interested in that. And so I wanted the alternative lifestyle stuff to have a bigger place in my life than it was having in the life I was having in California.
Mm.
And so when I got to New York and met some different people and traveled in some different circles, I connected with someone who later became my husband, who was hosting events. And so I began being able to host events and work with people. And that really started. So that was about 15 years ago that part of my journey started, where I was really helping people on their journey, just even by being an event host.
Okay. And for the events, what type of events were they?
They were swing events, and so they were like what you'd consider sex parties, and then ultimately BDSM events.
So I'm always learning and curious. So for these types of parties, what would you say is the struggle for people to talk about it and like as a couple make that decision? What do you think are the common problems people face when
A
one
lot of time,
person
the problem with couples is that there's usually one partner that's a little bit more willing than the other to do the exploration. The reticent partner is usually afraid. They're afraid that the people are all going to be weird, that that it's going to mean certain kinds of things. They just have more fears. And a lot of them are fears of the unknown. But you don't know what you're going to get out there when you go. So a lot of the work that I started to do around these events was sitting with people who were new and talking them through the things that they were concerned about. And I also, when I got to the point where I had my own club, which happened at a certain point over these last 15 years, it became very important to me that the space that I created and the space that I held for people was one of safety and comfort, so that people could come in and explore safely, that they weren't running the risk of being, adversely affected by other people that didn't have good boundaries and that sort of thing. So I ran a very tight ship when it came to people's safety. And I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people about their journey into the lifestyle, their journey into things alternative.
I mean, I'm one of those people. I don't know what the name for it is, but I'm one of those people. Like, if I get a cold, I'm like, I'm sick. I have hantavirus now, or I have whatever
Yeah.
the new virus is. So, like,
Hypochondriac.
yeah, there we go. So, how do you deal with someone who's afraid of like diseases, like the sexually transmitted diseases and things like that?
Well, when you wade into the adult waters, there's a certain degree of risk,
Yeah,
right? The risk is mitigated by safe practices. And so we talk about those, like using protection, having honest conversations, negotiating clearly with people what your boundaries are, having clear boundaries about what you are okay with and not okay with. And all of those things help. But there's always some small degree of risk when you do stuff like that. I mean, I kept a very clean environment as well, and that has a lot to do with it too, right? Like, so, making sure that all of the requisite supplies are available, cleaning, health, protection, and otherwise, and, that things are, but it's doable. It's doable. I mean, it depends just, I guess, on how severe the hangup is.
sure, sure. Can you talk to me a little bit about the leather scene and what that means or what that is? I have
Okay.
no idea
So
about it. So,
leather is a few different things depending on how you look at it. For me, leather is a lifestyle. It's a philosophy, it's a way of life. It means being a person that acts with integrity, that practices truth and transparency, that you're a person of your word, you do what you say and say what you mean, and it carries over into all the areas of my life, and it has nothing to do with what I wear. It has nothing to do with the fabric that is leather, what we think of as leather. On the other end of the spectrum, there's people who like put their leather clothes on and go out to the bars and hang out with their friends, and they call that leather. And that's the sum total of what it is for them, right? So, leather, of course, has its roots in the gay male community back in the 60s and 70s when it was a style, but it also indicated a way of life. So, leather and BDSM were very much connected, but you can be leather and not practice BDSM, and you can practice BDSM and not be leather. So they're not joined at the hip. There's an intersection, but they do separate.
Can you just clarify what your definition of BDSM is for listeners who maybe aren't aware or aren't?
So BDSM stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadomasochism. And it has to do with what you think of when you think of 50 Shades of Grey, you know, the whips and chains and all of that. It has to do with negotiated power exchange, power dynamics, right? What we call the dominant side and the submissive side. That's the D and the S in the middle. And so power exchange relationships are part of it. And then sadomasochism is actually a small part of it. People who enjoy giving and receiving pain for pain's sake, in the more classic sense that we describe sadomasochism, is actually a very small piece of it.
You mentioned that these types of kinks had some sort of connection with grief or with past traumas in relationships.
That's,
Am I misinterpreting that?
yeah, not exactly. What I mean is that everybody, vast majority of anybody has
Yeah,
issues with grief and trauma.
got it.
So people who are in the kink scene are no different.
Mm, okay.
But I'm really quick to not make that connection that trauma has anything to do with pursuing BDSM, because it really doesn't.
Okay.
There's no greater percentage of people in kink and BDSM who have trauma than anywhere else.
Mhm. So for someone who's in like just hi mom, hi dad, because they're probably going to listen to this as well.
Hi, mom and dad.
For someone who's into that BDSM or
Hmm.
for like the sex parties, how would you like, I guess for I'm just thinking of my parents, like how would you explain that to someone who's just completely like, why do people like that? Why are you like that's so weird to me? Why do you think there's such a
Listen, I've
huge
had these conversations with my own mother, right? And she says exactly that. If you're that far into the viewpoint of why would anybody want to do that, I can't possibly imagine what they would see in that. Then the only thing I have to say is, as long as nobody's getting hurt, as long as everybody's who is there is wanting to be there and is doing it in a safe and consensual way,
yeah,
then what harm is there?
yeah.
And there really isn't. Um, and so to leave it at that. I mean, just because it's my kink doesn't mean it has to be your kink, right?
Yeah, definitely. So when you since you've been in these communities, have there been any type of culture shift that you've seen maybe? What was popular before versus what's popular now?
Not so much. I think that there have been shifts back and forth between, you know, when it all first started, consent was a little bit looser. It's come a little bit more to the fore. I think now people are really focused on consent and negotiation and having conversations ahead of time and really negotiating boundaries and negotiating what they want. And we certainly are advocates of that. And I think that's become a little bit more mainstream.
And then your podcast explores the topics of BDSM and
The podcast that I do is called the Conscious Kinky Podcast,
okay,
right? And we explore topics that have to do with relationships and that have to do with power in relationships. Knowing yourself, finding your language, being able to show up. This last month, the topic for the podcast was called the mirror, and we talked about what does it mean to see yourself in other people. What does it mean to see we did a whole episode on triggers. What does it mean to be triggered? How do we deal with activation when it comes up? How do we see it in our relationships? How do we see it in ourselves? And then the one that's coming out on Wednesday next week, or today's Thursday, so it came out yesterday, is
okay.
on ownership, right? Owning what happens when you're triggered or activated in trauma. All different things that have to do with how you relate to yourself and the people around you.
Does that include with just my mind's going back to the parties and stuff? When does that include when someone makes a connection that's more than just the party afterwards? Does
Oh
that
yeah, the podcast doesn't. We actually don't do a lot of event work anymore.
okay,
The work that we do now is about how people connect with themselves and with each other.
got it. So does this go along more of your counseling work then?
It does. It also does education work. We offer free master classes once a month where we
Okay.
talk about these topics, and then we have a 12-week mentorship program. That's an online mentorship program that walks people through understanding energy exchange, power exchange, vetting and discernment. It all starts with introspection, how to really know yourself, how to really take stock of who you are and what's real for you, what your desires are, what matters to you, and helping people find the language to communicate that to other people. So that's the work that I do now.
That's awesome. Why do you think people struggle to communicate? That's actually something that I think it's just a very common trait I've seen, especially in the younger generations.
Did anybody teach you how to communicate coming up?
I want to say that I had great examples, but no, I was not taught
And
exactly how
most
to.
of us weren't taught. And then, the examples we got were the examples that we got, good, bad, or indifferent. But most of us aren't taught how to know what we want, how to know how we feel, how to find the language that corresponds to the things that we think and feel and want and desire, and then how to use those words to accurately convey those to other people.
Yeah,
Most of us at some point learned that if we showed up and we said too much, that people told us we were too much. Or people showed up and if they asked for what they wanted and they couldn't get their needs met, then what's the point of asking? So people stop asking for what they want, right? We all, most of us came through in a way that we either learned that it wasn't okay to be our full authentic selves, or we learned that people didn't have the time or whatever. Lats don't care. It's not because people mean to raise us this way. It's just what happens. And so a lot of people, trundle off into adulthood without all the skills that they could have to be able to communicate clearly.
yeah. I think just communication. You're right. Is something I think I even need to spend more time teaching my son on how to communicate. Especially since you just brought it into light, basically, that I was never taught. So I'm like, oh shit, now I got to do it. So in the Kink Collective, you guys mentioned people before kink. Can you break that down a little bit for me? Because
Mhm.
on the surface, I think it sounds simple, but I can imagine living it is probably really demanding.
Well, it started because we would go into spaces either for events that we were hosting or other people's events, and we would be confronted with, Mistress, Mistress, will you flog me? I don't know you. Like, I've never met you. How about, hi, my name's Kat. It's very objectifying to be treated
Mhm.
like a kink dispenser. Like, not only do you not know me, you don't know what I am or what I do, and you come at me and you assume a bunch of stuff from either the way I'm dressed or what you think or the fact that I host the event. And we got really tired of being objectified. We got really tired of being treated like kink dispensers. And so the philosophy basically says that who you are as a person comes before any other way that you identify. And it carries over out of kink. It's like I'm cat before I'm queer, I'm cat before I'm female, I'm cat before I'm poly, I'm cat before I'm anything. I'm a person before any of the other ways that I identify. And I would much rather you get to know me as a person than worry about what boxes I might check off.
That's actually
We talk about, if you go through the world with that philosophy where you are willing to meet people as people first, life is short and we start thinking in shorthands. And one of the things that I say in our weekend intensive is that, if in your very busy life, you are wanting for a babysitter for your children and a tennis partner because you want to play tennis and you don't have a tennis partner, then suddenly you start seeing everyone you meet through the lens of, can you be my babysitter or my tennis partner? Right. And if they can't fulfill either of those two things, then you're on to the next. And how dismissive that is and how short-sighted that is, right? Because the person in front of you could be your next best friend, but you wouldn't know that if all you're looking for is a babysitter or a tennis partner.
this reminds me a little bit of a speech I heard over the weekend, last weekend, about everything being transactional and how a lot of, especially I live in Los Angeles, so it feels like that's how it always is here with other artists or any creatives. But maybe we can talk a little bit about why do you think that people tend to lean that way first before leaning human first?
I don't know if I have any real good insight as to why it is that way. I think it's easier. I think it's shorthand. I think it's less scary. I think we live in a transactional culture. What can you do for me is sort of has a value, right? We're trained by the culture really to see things like that and to look at things like that.
Maybe you can provide a tip on how to not look at it that way. Like, I'm honored that you even wanted to come out on my podcast, and that to me was like really cool. I didn't really expect that, and just having you here and being able to have this conversation openly without even really knowing each other beforehand, it's a meaningful interaction for me.
Mm,
So
thank
I
you.
get, I guess what I'm saying is like, hey, I don't feel like this was transactional for us. So what would you say is like the difference in like how, like what I don't know, is there something that people can do to before they make some sort of decision, like communicating how to stop themselves from like, is there I'm almost thinking out loud, like, is there a moment where like, hey,
Well,
it's
I what I can do is I can offer you one of the frameworks that we use. One of the frameworks we developed we call MISS, MISS. And what it does is it basically slows things down. So rather than meeting someone and launching headlong into either telling them your whole life story when you've just met them or interviewing them for this or that or whatever, what we do is we recommend breaking it down into 4 parts. The first part is meet. M is for meet. So when you meet people, you just meet them. Hi, my name's Kat. What's your name? And we're just getting to know them in a very light way, right? To try to see what the vibe is, see how it feels to talk to someone, see if you're being heard, see if you're being received for what it is you're sharing, if you're being listened to, right? And just taking it easy, slowing it down, right? After that, if we like the person and we want to move on to the next phase, then I stands for invest. We begin to invest a little bit of time. Hey, do you want to grab a coffee? Or you spend a little bit more time talking. This is not the stage at which you start offing your whole life story or any of that kind of thing, right? I don't know how many of if you or your listeners are ever guilty of TMI, but this is the antidote to TMI. So now we just start investing a little bit of time, asking some more questions. Maybe you go out somewhere, you can see, how many times have you met somebody and you've gotten a good vibe and then you go somewhere together and you watch how they treat the wait staff and you're like, oh, that was eye-opening. Right? Like you get to see a person in different environments and see how they interact with people other than you. Like how do they treat people, right? And so we're still, and if at that point we still want to move forward, then we start sharing information. And this is when we start letting out other parts of our story, not the whole thing, but parts that are relevant, but the person earns your trust. The person earns the right to your resources, your time, your body, your attention, your energy. And then the fourth one, the second S, is for shared experience. And that's when you start, you've gone through all the stages, you've met the person, you've invested some time, you've shared some information with them, and now you're going to share experiences. Hey, we both like Britney Spears and Britney Spears is coming into concert. Let's go to the show. To necessarily end up like in a kink involvement. Like we teach this everywhere. And so MISS, this an acronym, is helpful for slowing your roll and being able to meet someone as they are for who they are.
wow. I really like that. I'm gonna remember that. And I'm thinking back, like when we started this conversation with Kat, was I doing this miss or was I dismissing this miss? I was like reprocessing our whole combo, but I'll remember to take a breath for slowing down. I did want to talk about your trauma and grief part a little bit more. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that people maybe misunderstand and don't consider grief? And I'm talking just my dad, for example, who is from maybe an older generation that doesn't really consider mental health a thing, maybe doesn't acknowledge why certain folks would be struggling with depression or things like that. And though we've made strides, what are some of the things that people maybe don't know is that it actually is trauma, actually is grief, and maybe they don't communicate it or don't know it labeled that way?
One of the first things that I do when I encounter someone who's lost someone close, someone who's lost a parent, lost a child, lost a partner, one of the first things that I'll do is tell them to slow down. You have the rest of your life to be, in my case, the little girl who lost her mom, right? Like that's going to be true for me. It was true for me when I'm 11 and it's true for me at 61. So what's my hurry? We live in a culture that really encourages us to hurry up and get over it. People who are still grieving a year or two later, you start to get sideways glances from people like, oh, honey, aren't you over that yet? Especially if the world around you moves on a little bit and you're still struggling. People look at you like the problem is yours. And the truth is grief has its own timetable. And when you've lost someone significant, it's a permanent loss. And so there's no rush. You have the rest of your whole life to deal with it. And that's a good thing to know. I mean, I can tell you that over the years, my mother passed away on the 14th of November, and every November, it's a slightly different experience. In the beginning, I would be thinking about it, and then the day would come and I would forget about it, and the next day I would remember and I would be devastated. I would think must have meant I was the worst daughter ever because I couldn't remember it on the day that it happened. And then there would be years that would happen and I wouldn't think of it at all, and then all of a sudden I would realize it was the 14th of November and I'd be struck, like grief stricken and a sobbing heap on the floor. Like then some years would happen and I wouldn't think of it much at all. Every year's been a different experience, and I'll continue to have these experiences until my dying day.
Yeah.
There's no hurry. Grief has its own timetable, and I think it's important for people who are grieving to know that and to be able to lean into the fact that it's okay, and you don't have to hurry up and do anything on anyone else's timetable.
And what is one word maybe you wish more people used when talking about grief or trauma?
Grace is the first word that comes to mind.
Yeah. Having grace, and showing or being present, I guess, is important, definitely. So,
Mhm.
what about one word that you would reject if someone were to talk about it regarding trauma and grief?
I don't know, expectations?
Mm,
Like the expectation that something should happen a certain kind of way or that people should do things in a certain kind of way.
yeah. No, yeah, that's good. Yeah, setting expectations for that kind of stuff that has nothing to do with you,
Yeah.
especially if you're talking about someone else's grief, right? Talk to me a little bit about being stuck.
Mm.
I know you help get people get unstuck, but
Yeah.
for someone who's feeling stuck,
For someone who's feeling stuck, it's important to be able to have a safe space, however you find that. If you're lucky enough to have trusted friends or a therapist or a coach or a counselor or anybody to be able to sit and process. I help people because I hold space for people and I'm able to talk through things with people, and I have a way of putting things together in a way that lets you see reflected back to you what it is you're dealing with and how you're dealing with it.
mhm,
But I mean, I'm not unique. Like that process is available to people in other ways. But it's important to be in a process where you're held and contained and there's space for you and your stuff and you can take it out and look at it in safety. I'm a journal writer. I write all the time. I'm a big advocate for journal writing. If you have no other outlet or available, then the blank spaces of a notebook can be your safe container.
yeah, definitely. I actually do have a notebook here. It's mine has a little bit of words here in the front, says some shit to remember. So I
Ah,
usually write down the important stuff,
yeah.
and it has no lines in a notebook. In
Mhm.
the notebook, I forgot where I read it, but something about having lines in a notebook limits your mind to a certain space. And so
Hmm.
when you buy a notebook with no lines, the idea is it keeps your mind open to anything because there's no boundaries.
I like that. That sounds very artistic.
Yeah, yeah, I forgot where I heard that from.
Yeah. I use the lined blank notebooks because for me there's a great deal of freedom that comes from just pouring things out, getting the words out, just writing and writing. And sometimes I write and write and I'm writing what seems like nonsense, silly nothing stuff. And then all of a sudden a couple 3 pages in, stuff starts to come out. That's the stuff that needs to come out.
So for the things that don't come out, how crucial is it for someone who's holding that back? Like, I know, just as an example, if someone's listening to this today where they're not saying the things that they need to say, they're holding that stuff in, the impact that it causes, what does that weigh on someone?
It can be a lot depending on what it is you're holding back. I encourage anyone who's in a position like that to find a safe space somewhere. And if you can't find it in another person, then at least in the pages of a journal or something. It impacts how you feel, it impacts your health, it impacts your emotional wellness, it impacts your relationships.
You've been
Be honest is with yourself and hopefully with another person is important.
yeah, you've been mentioning a couple times now, say, create a safe space, create a safe space. What would be like a good advice for someone who is doesn't know what a safe space can look like?
A safe space is just simply if we're talking about a one-on-one interaction, right? The person who's sitting with you, you can speak your truth and you won't be judged. You can speak your truth and you won't be invalidated. You won't be made fun of. You won't be questioned. You'll be held with positive regard for who you are as a person and for anything you bring to the space. It's safe from the standpoint that you don't have to fear reprisal or judgment or being looked at askance for anything that you might have to say, so that you can feel free to speak honestly about what you have going on and so you can get it out.
Do you see there I mean, I think there is the difference between having that safe space with someone who knows you, that may be like just I'm saying a relationship between a son and a father, versus a safe space with someone like a friend, or a safe space versus someone else? Why do you think some people struggle with certain communication with other folks?
Well, a lot of that has to do with history, right? Between a parent and a child, there's a whole life history for the child, at least to the whatever, if we're talking about a 30-year-old adult child, they have a
Yeah.
30-year relationship with their parent that's probably got a lot in it, has colored the sense of connection one way or another. That's a very different type of a connection than the safe space of like a therapist, someone who doesn't know you, who's trained, hopefully, to hold a safe enough space for someone to come in and process. That's not always the case. That's why
Right.
you have to, research that stuff carefully so that you get the right fit. But those are two very different relationships, two very different interactions or situations for communication. I know plenty of people who can bring anything to a family. They have family members with whom they can talk about anything with. And then I know people who, they don't speak to their blood families. The family dynamics, if what you need to process has to do with, you don't necessarily go to your father to process the stuff that you have about your father.
Sure. Yeah, no, he would love that. So, just because it's a hot topic right now, and I think everybody's talking about it, I'm going to bring up the topic of AI. And I'm just curious because I am one of those people that uses AI very actively,
Hmm.
and I'm very engaged with it at
Hmm.
work, in my life, in general. I've seen reports where a lot of folks are using it for therapy or for help. So, what are your feelings on people using AI to help with grief, to help with trauma? And then what would you say? Yeah, let's start with the how you feel about it first.
I don't have feelings about it one way or another. I'm a fairly big proponent of anything that works. And I've done some work with AI. I was actually just doing that before we got on this call. Me and my partners have each just gotten our own Claude accounts. And so uh, we're all working with it professionally, but I've also done some introspective work with AI and I find it interesting. They're all trained. If you don't train them how to speak to you, they all speak to you in very positive, you get a lot of positive reflection back. And frankly, for some people, they don't get that in the rest of their lives. And so it can be very validating. It can be very positively reinforcing to have anybody speak to you the way AI is trained essentially inherently to speak to us. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's useful. And I think if you're a person that has deep trust issues and finds it hard to speak to humans, then at least speaking to an AI is better than just sitting alone with the things that trouble you. That's just, very basic opinion on my part.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I feel like the more and more I use it, the more and more I've become not dependent on it, but almost like, I rely on it a lot. And
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm just always curious as to what people think because there's always the two sides of, yes,
Well,
use it.
there's people who are it and they're
Yeah.
terrified of it, and there's all kinds of stuff out there about it, and it's like hating the incoming wave. I mean, it's coming, it's here, it's not going anywhere. So I think making friends with it is probably the best bet.
Yeah, saying please and thank you. So, uh, at Soul Meets Heart, we talk about where career and soul collide. And I'm just curious, because of your journeys that you've had,
Hmm.
where do you think you are right now? And what is your next steps? What are you focusing on specifically? Or where do you want to be more? What energy is drawing you more towards everything currently?
I've been very connected to my recovery community. And so on my personal spiritual journey, I'm at a place where I'm really trying to reconnect to my sense of God or the universe, as it were, and sort of redoubling my efforts around that. That's what I thought. Why I thought the message that you gave to me from the other speaker was so helpful because it really, that idea of giving the ball over to God, like understanding that that God's the partner. God, like that resonated for me because that's a part of my recovery journey. And so I've been working with that. And then with my business and my partners, I have two partners and we all work together in addition to live together. And so we're working on building this this business where we help people. And so being able to scale what we do so we can help more people, so we can have a positive impact in more people's lives is what I'm focusing my energies on going forward.
Is there anything specifically about your community or your people right now that you'd like people to know more about?
Be more specific. I'm not sure what you mean.
Oh, like, so if I were someone who was listening and I'd be interested in learning more about you or your community and your
Oh,
work, like,
yeah.
what specifically do you want the audience to know about that can help draw them to join your community or to be a
Mm,
part of your community? That could be the podcast, that could be what you're trying to do with.
yeah. Well, the mentorship program, the programming that we do, the education that the podcast has with it a Tuesday night discussion group that we do, an online discussion group that meets on Zoom where you get to come with the questions from the podcast and answer them with other people in real time.
Oh, cool.
And so that's a really beautiful program. We have a great community there. And if you want to be surrounded by people who are also on a journey, really seeking and doing the work, because one of the things that happens when you really start digging in and doing this like self discovery work is, the air gets a little rarefied. Not everybody wants to do this kind of work. And so it becomes more important to be able to find people who also do it, who also want to do this kind of work.
So I'm glad you brought that up because you're building something that I think requires you to be a face, to be a voice, and a container even for like other people's feelings or healing.
Hmm.
So it's all happening at the same time. What does your replenishment look like? Like what do you use to like, I don't know, disconnect from these like heavier conversations?
Well, they feed me really. I mean, I'm not depleted by them. This kind of work, I'm more depleted by half a day at the computer doing tedious tasks than I am having heavy conversations with people. I can show up for the heavy conversations all day. If I could just get an executive assistant to take care of all of the tedium in my life, I would be overjoyed. I like to take naps. Naps work for me. Yeah, I like to listen to music. I like to dance. I like to color. I like to cook. Taking care of my family is very satisfying for me. Keeping everybody nurtured and fed.
So
So
self-care,
those are some of
time
the
with
things that
family.
I do to balance the energy around these deeper conversations that we have with people.
Yeah, definitely. Taking care of yourself and
Hmm.
time with family is always important. Kat, we have another tradition here at the show, and I actually used AI to create this part of it. But basically, what we're gonna do is we're gonna draw a soul card, which is just gonna have an emotion tied to it, and then we're gonna have a question that's drawn from a different deck, and that question has to be answered through that emotion's perspective, right? So if your story is about if the question ends up being like, I don't know, uh talk about your most impactful career moment, and then the emotion that we have is love and it's the topic is gift, you have to talk about a career moment that felt like a gift for you. So something along those lines. Maybe not a great example, but we'll see how it lines
Okay.
up. So here we go. The emotion card that you drew is tied to identity. So talking about authentic and being authentic, your authentic self. And then the question is, what did it feel like to you when you said yes to being on this show? And was there anything that made you hesitate, if anything?
No, I was very excited to want to be on the show. I was curious what soul meets heart meant, and yeah, no, I was genuinely and authentically thrilled that you would want to have me on. And so, yeah, that's easy. That's simple. I'm excited to be on. And
I'm glad. Thank you.
yeah.
Soul Meets Heart for me is more about just diving a little deeper than just the regular questions, and it's curiosity, feeding the soul really is
Hmm.
what it comes down to.
Hmm.
I'm a very spiritual person, you probably already noticed, but I'm not religious, so I don't consider myself any theologic,
Hmm.
like I don't base my ideas on just one theology. I'm very open to everything. So, it's definitely fun for me to connect, and I'm a very big believer in like connections soul make, and the fact that you and I are even having this conversation, to me, I know we agreed on it before we were born, and before we were even born, and it's just now that we're connecting and this is how we connected, and I really appreciate you and your patience with me. and also your kind of understanding of like, hey, I'm kind of new to what it is you're talking about, and I was also very curious about a lot of things, and so I appreciate you making the space as you do a great job at it. So I can already tell that you're really good at this. But thank you for making that space for me to feel comfortable enough to feel like I can ask those questions and whatnot. So thank you for that.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Yeah, I want to ask, where can our community find you? Where can they follow the podcast? Anything that you want to?
So the Conscious Kinky podcast is on Spotify and YouTube, so you can find them there. And my website, kinkcollective.net, is where you can find me, the rest of me. Kink Collective NYC at Gmail. If you wanted to email me directly, you're more than welcome to. I'm not hard to get a hold of. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk to anybody. I'm also going to encourage you to have conversations with my two partners. And then if you like them, we can all come back and talk about poly.
Nice. That'd be very interesting for me, and I have a lot of questions for that. And I can definitely be more just talking about, because right now I kind of wanted to dive into a little bit of everything that
Yeah.
you do, but for that, I
Yeah.
think that'll be a fun episode to look forward to. So, with that being said, I just want to thank you for joining us today, Kat. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And for everybody out there, don't lose faith, lose fear, peace, and let your heart be light. I'll see you guys.